better business, and a better life begin here. Welcome to Business is Art on True Chat with author and business consultant, John Umstead.
Hey, thank you for tuning in to Business is Art. Today on the agenda, we'll be talking about sales strategy execution. And before we get started with that, I'd like to invite our listeners to, hey, check out my website, plancanvas.net. Connect with me directly on Twitter at John Umstead or on LinkedIn. Reach out to me any number of ways, but I'd love to hear from you and start a conversation. But as for this conversation, again, we're going to be talking about sales strategy execution. And our guest today is Steve McCullough. Steve is the founder and CEO of Buyer Aligned Selling. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Thank you, John. It's great to be here.
We're glad to have you here. This is a great topic. Our listeners are constantly interested in topics like this. Just how can I do a better job of marketing, promoting, selling, running my business a little bit better? So great topic for listeners. And again, we really appreciate you being here. So to get things started, why don't we have you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, if you would, please?
I've been in sales and sales leadership for 30 years. Most of my career has been in B2B sales. Early in my career, I was B2C, but I shifted to B2B, and I've worked, and that's business to business, and I've worked primarily with small to medium-sized companies in technology and professional services. Some of the things that I've had the pleasure and opportunity to be a part of early in my career, at one stage, I was employee number 9 of a services company and helped grow that company to $11 million in annual revenue within 3 years. After that, I joined an $8 million company, and we grew that to $80 million, and we sold it to a larger public company. And I stayed on for a while we were trading on the NASDAQ exchange. And today, through Buyer Aligned Selling, I primarily help small companies grow their top-line capabilities and results, primarily through strategic advisory work, leadership coaching, and sales best practice training.
Okay, great. Appreciate it. And, this isn't necessarily germane to the conversation that we're going to have, but just kind of curious because I've had some similar experiences going from privately owned to acquired and owned by publicly traded companies. What was that experience like for you? Was there any difference for you from Friday when you were with a privately owned company to Monday when you were with a publicly traded company that had just acquired you?
Yeah, well, it was very different. We did two things. Number one, we merged with another company and became part of this larger public company. So it shifted and changed my role. My role was primarily around the division that we were in. But one of the interesting things is, and something that I consult with my clients a lot on, is around forecast accuracy. It's one thing to tell your private board what you believe your sales results are going to be in a given quarter, but when you tell that to the broader market on a public exchange, you need to be right or close to right, because if you miss your mark, you can get hurt bad through the investor reaction. So we had to really tighten up we had a very tight process to begin with, but really had to tighten it even more so and have a lot more scrutiny around our forecast to make sure that we were advising the market on what was really expected.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I'm glad to hear that you had tight processes going into it, because I don't know about you, but I've worked with many companies, business owners or organizational leaders that really had inflated expectations and would throw out numbers that just didn't pass the sniff test, right? They throw out revenue projections that your first thought is, how in the world is that going to happen? Could be possible, but I don't see a path forward. It happens quite a bit, and it's really important for us to be honest with ourselves when we're looking at those types of forecasts.
Yeah, I see it in less so in public companies, but in private companies, it's a real challenge. And it's a challenge having the disciplines in place to have an understanding of what you really expect to happen. And the larger your team gets, the more you're going to rely on those disciplines, because just a handful of salespeople out driving business is one thing. In the $80 million company, I had 90 people in my organization, so we had to keep everybody in between the lines in terms of how we forecasted and what was required to be able to say that a particular opportunity was going to have a high likelihood of closing.
And we may touch on this some more. We just kind of accidentally fell into it when I asked you about your corporate experience, but we'll come back to it. But I'm sure that as we talk about sales strategy execution, and some of the things that we'll discuss around that topic, a good sales strategy execution begins with setting some realistic sales goals and targets, perhaps some stretch in there, but achievable. So. All right. Well, let's come back to that in a little bit. But first, why don't you tell us a little bit about buyer aligned selling, your business?
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully the name kind of describes what it is. It's really as much a practical philosophy we have as much as a business. And it really comes down to the idea that in the last 5 to 10 years of my corporate career, John, I was seeing some pretty dramatic shifts taking place. First and foremost, the buyer-seller dynamic and the buyer-seller relationship has been shifting as a result of, we're all moving into this information age. And what I started noticing is that our buyers were more informed. They felt more empowered. Increasingly, there was a move towards buy by committee. In other words, it was very rare for us to have 1 or 2 decision makers. It wasn't uncommon at all to have 6, 8, or 10 people who had influence over a particular buying decision. And then the other thing that really kind of made this incredibly challenging was that gaining access to decision makers themselves and real authority with organizations became harder and harder. There are more and more firewalls within organizations. And so what I started observing is the sales individuals on my team and the teams that I managed who had an understanding of kind of the buyer decision journey and how that was shifting and how they needed to adapt their selling strategies to this whole kind of shift in reality. They were the ones that were having greater success than folks who were still selling like it was 2000 or 1995. And so I launched the company, and effectively what we do is we help organizations map their sales strategy to their ideal client's buyer journey, kind of get an understanding of what that is, and then help those teams understand how to be effective in closing business and assisting those buyers and enabling them through a decision process, rather than being a product oriented or even a solution only oriented sales approach. You have to be much more adaptable and buyer focused in today's world. So that's really what we're all about.
And is it generally focused on B2B as the bulk of your career has been?
Yeah, I'm exclusively B2B. I do get asked from time to time, insurance agencies or real estate agencies. It's not really my background. And I'm sure a lot of the same ideas probably do translate. Some of the new realities exist on the other side of the aisle, but I don't feel like I can really be as impactful in B2C. 25 years in B2B, so that's really where I like to focus.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure there are a lot of similarities as well as differences. When you mention the buyer journey, we talk about customer journey when we're talking about B2C type of selling, and I'm sure that there are some things that are very, very close to the same, but also unique differences because it is different. The motivations are different.
Well, for one thing, what I'm seeing in terms of committee buying is obviously less in a B2C model. There might be one or two or three individuals who are going to have influence over a consumer purchase, and it tends to be family, right, or friends. But in a business environment, I had in my last corporate role, we had a very large 7-figure opportunity that we closed. We had 17 signatures we had to get to get that opportunity across the goal line. So that sort of thing makes it unique, I think. The B2B space,
and can add quite a bit of a tail at the end of actually closing that deal entirely to get to contract. Yeah, I once waited for 2 years for a deal that we were announced as the winner of a bid for a particular service, and it was a 2-year wait to get it through all of the levels of signature, and actually in this case through the New York City mayor's office. It was pretty frustrating. But
yeah, well, in those larger pursuits. Learning that you won the business is often the beginning of the more difficult journey of navigating that approval and funding and all of that, those processes.
Yep. And a lot of times there's absolutely nothing you can do about it but wait. So, all right. Hey, Steve, let's take a moment to remind our listeners to join the discussion. Hey, you can do so by finding TrueChat on social media at TrueChat.org. That's TrueChat.org, or you can reach out to me directly on Twitter at John Umstead, as mentioned earlier. But we would love to hear from you out there. We want to know what you think of today's episode, what you thought of past episodes, what you'd like to hear in the future, and just start a general discussion. That's the way we can keep this moving in a direction that you want to hear. So please do reach out. Let's get back to this conversation. We're talking about sales strategy execution with Steve McCullough. He's the founder and CEO of Buyer Aligned Selling. So Steve, what are some of the biggest sales execution challenges that you see in today's sales organizations?
One is just this idea that the buyer dynamic is changing so radically. It's said now that the estimates are between 57 and 75% of a decision journey that a buyer goes through is complete before they want to reach out to a salesperson. And so sales professionals are no longer the protected guardians of information that we used to be. And that creates a lot of challenges in terms of how do you demonstrate value, and how do you gain access when your buyers are so well educated and empowered. The other one that I see, and we talk about this from a private to public move, is forecast inaccuracies. I work with clients all the time who have wild swings from quarter to quarter, and wild swings in terms of how closely they nailed their forecast estimate. And even in private companies, that's really, really important, because as you're doing strategic planning around cash flow and product requirements and all of those sorts of things, having an accurate forecast is essential to being able to plan and run your business. I think there's another challenge that I see around clients, around new client acquisition. We're seeing an emergence of more hunter-farmer sales models, and I'm a big fan of that. And one of the reasons is that it's harder and harder to gain new logos and add new clients in a lot of industries to your customer portfolio. And so I think a lot of organizations, do a good job of keeping their accounts, but often struggle with growing their list of accounts. And those new accounts, they're tomorrow's growth opportunity. And I guess the last thing I would say is around the idea of productivity. There are hundreds and hundreds today sales productivity tools, and oftentimes what I see being deployed is either not the right tool or not thinking about the main problem from a productivity perspective that really needs to be solved, or it's a tool that hasn't been effectively integrated into the sales strategy and the sales process. So many times, I was talking to a client this morning about CRM, Salesforce, in fact, and one of the biggest challenges I see, and one of the biggest cautions I would offer is temper your optimism about how far you want to take it and how fast. Because I see more and more bloated CRM implementations that are stifling productivity instead of unlocking and enabling productivity. So those are just a few that kind of come to mind that I see out there.
Yeah, I can draw some direct parallels to what you just said in the line of business I'm in. So, my own software plan, Canvas, is a tool, but just like Salesforce or HubSpot or any number of other tools out there that support the sales function, that's all they are. They're tools. They are enabling technology, but you still have to do the work. So many times people, think, oh, I'm subscribing to HubSpot now. My business is going to blow up. And, it still requires your effort. It still requires that blood, sweat, and tears, right? You've got to get a little dirty and rub some elbow grease in it.
Yeah. I mean, to your point, just because you have a hammer doesn't mean you don't have to swing it.
Right.
Yeah. You still have to grab a nail and hit the nail. And unfortunately, there is a lot of exuberance and optimism about what a new tool will provide. And that exuberance is oftentimes overbaked, and it creates more problems than it solves. Yep. When you try to take something and solve all the world's problems, all of your organization's problems with tools, it just doesn't work that way.
Right, absolutely. And I want to also go back to something you mentioned about forecast inaccuracies. But first, speaking of solving problems, all the podcasts on our network pursue a common goal. True Chat's mission is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And if you have any ethical concerns with today's episode, please email ethics@truechat.org. Again, that's ethics@truechat.org. Let's get back to the topic at hand. We're talking about sales strategy execution. So, Steve, a couple of times now you've talked about forecast accuracy or forecast inaccuracy, and in the early openings of the show, we talked about how setting those sales expectations is part of having a good sales strategy that you can execute too. So relative to that, do you have any suggested frameworks or processes that you follow for developing an effective sales strategy?
At a very high level, I would say, obviously sales strategy has to contemplate what's your market focus, what's your channel strategy. Are you direct? Are you through distribution, through resellers? How do you go to market? How do you connect with your customers? Things like staffing plans and competitive assessments. But when I think about execution of strategy, in my career, I kind of developed, for me, everybody's got a favorite acronym, right? I developed an acronym that has always worked for me, and it's GO ACT, GOACT. And the first thing, what that stands for, the first letter G, is about your goal. And I know a lot of folks like SMART goals, and I'll get to that, but I find that SMART goals need to sit under more of a directional goal. Like, as an example, we need to improve growth in XYZ vertical. That would be your goal, is we need to have an improvement over here. Like me personally, I'm trying to get healthier and more fit. There's not a number associated to that yet, but I know what it looks like. Yeah, exactly. And then the O in go is the objective, and that is the measurable. So if we say improve growth in XYZ vertical, it's, specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. So how much can we measure it, and by when, and is that a reasonable goal? So maybe we want to increase new logo development in that vertical by 25% in 2019, and we state that that's our goal. So the go part of my acronym has always been around where am I going, and it describes what I'm trying to get to, just at a broad level, and then at a more specific level. And then ACT is about A is action plan, C is cadence, and T is transparency. So the action plan are your specific strategies. Tactics, milestones, or leading indicators. Like maybe we need to have every rep needs to have 20 meetings with new logo targets every month. That's a leading indicator that's going to indicate whether or not you're making progress in terms of trying to sign those new logo accounts. Or maybe it's we need to implement an account-based marketing tool. Or maybe we need to just identify X number of new logos that we want to pursue. That's the first milestone we've got to accomplish, is that we need to first of all figure out who are the targets we want to go focus on. So the action plan is stuff like that. Cadence is how do we regularly track our progress and make necessary adjustments. And there are some activities you're going to do that are going to have a weekly cadence. There's some activities that are going to have a monthly cadence. Some activities are going to have a quarterly cadence, or maybe even longer term commitments are going to have a even longer cadence than that. But you need to regularly plan to review your progress as a team, see how it's going, and you might need to make adjustments to that action plan as a result. And the last piece is transparency. Nothing happens in a vacuum. And this is one of the reasons why I love Plain Canvas. What I've looked at, and I've shared this with you, is that being able to have visibility across the organization is, in my opinion, critical. Because sales, if I'm just focused on sales, we can't do it alone. We need product, we need marketing, we need customer success, we need, finance, we need everybody being a part of us selling and supporting us in a variety of different ways. And they also need to understand how we're progressing against those objectives. And so, how do we share those results? How do we share the challenges across the organization? And it's a reporting, it's a like Plain Canvas, it's a framework that you can update. How do you create transparency across the organization? I used to have a coworker that said, without systems thinking, evil things happen. And they don't happen intentionally, they happen unintentionally, right? So Go ACT is the framework I've always used, goal, objective, action plan, cadence, transparency. If you have those 5 things, you're more likely to be successful than if you don't, in my opinion.
Yep. No, I completely agree. And I love the acronym Go ACT. So we've talked a little bit about some of the things that have been shifts in the buyer's journey, particularly in the B2B world. How are companies responding to that and creating their sales strategies? What are the implications in some of those shifts as far as what they do in response to them?
Well, great question. I think one of the first shifts that really successful companies are doing well is they're realizing that when you look at this, this idea that 60 to 70% of the buyer journey is happening absent a sales professional, then we realize we have to marry our digital marketing and our sales process and our sales strategies. Those two functions cannot operate in silos. We need to develop kind of a common language, a continuous process. A lot of organizations get down to the level of defining what is a MQL, a marketing qualified lead, versus an SQL, a sales qualified lead? What are those handoffs between somebody coming to your website and maybe clicking on your newsletter, right, to downloading white papers and downloading stuff that indicates they're going deeper and deeper in the sales process, into a decision process, and how and when do you engage sales, and how can sales be informed by all of that digital activity in that first meeting? Those kinds of things I think are one of the things I see good companies do well, and I help companies with. Number two, I think, is, and we kind of touched on this earlier around tools, is technology can be a tremendous lever, and using that to broaden your reach, or to be more surgical in your reach. So there's a lot of really good database questions, that database tools that are out there that can help you kind of focus more. And lastly, I would say that good companies are using inside and social selling teams more effectively. They still have often field teams where it's appropriate, but it's also teamed up with folks who can be more responsive and more productive, because they're in one place able to handle multiple conversations, multiple interactions within a limited amount of time. So I think those are some of the things that I'm seeing shifting that better companies are doing.
I do want to hit on a topic that I know is important to both of us, and that is around measurements. There's this little monster called key performance indicators, or KPIs, and they're very important components of. You were talking about measurable objectives a little bit ago, smart objectives. You can't have a smart objective without a KPI as a component of it. Beyond the obvious, I want to sell more. I want to sell X number of widgets. What are some important KPIs, or some of the most important KPIs that you see in sales strategy?
That's a great question. I would say they vary from industry to industry, client to client, that I work with.
That's a great consultant answer. It just depends.
It depends, right? That's a non-answer, right? It's like a politician. But I would say some of the ones that I go back to that are more common. One is new business percent as of your mix. So what percent of your sales closings, your sales opportunities at close as a number and as a dollar figure, and what percent of your total sales revenue does that represent? Because that is a really good measure of whether or not you're growing. If you're not growing new accounts, somebody's taking away your accounts. Accounts are leaving. It's hard to sustain long-term growth without having new account acquisition. By the same token, the percent of add-on business as a percent of mix, that is a strong measure indicator of account satisfaction and what I call sales account management intimacy. Are you really well connected and staying in touch with your buyers? Because we all know it's, 1/5 as costly to sell to an existing customer than it is to bring in a new customer. So there's often a lot of opportunity there within your existing accounts. And so you want that measure to be high. We touched on pipeline accuracy. I won't go too much in that, but for me, that is a measure of the reliability and predictability of your sales process. So do you have a system that you can rely on, or is it a lot of guesswork? And then lastly, I would say proposal to close ratio. This is really a measure, and it's much higher than a lot of people think. I hear people say, well, it's 25% or 30%. If you're doing that many proposals, you're doing too many. Proposal to close ratio needs to be greater than 50%, in my opinion. That doesn't mean that all opportunities go to proposal, but when you get there, it's a big investment of time and energy. And so as a result, you need to do it only when you feel like you have a very good chance of winning the business. And that's, again, a metric around, your effectiveness as a selling organization.
And that's a great point. I mean, that's sort of the background that I came from, developing those proposals in response to requests for proposals in B2B selling. And you're right; it's absolutely a huge investment in time and resources, because a lot of the people that are on the proposal development team have their day jobs as well. They're subject matter experts in something, so they're delivering on other contracts and taking time away to be part of the proposal team. So it's an extra burden for a lot of those folks as well. And we had some pretty specific rules of thumb and processes that we went through before we made any determination whether we were going to write and submit a proposal or not. And it began with, what are our odds? Do we think we have a pretty good chance of winning this? And every once in a while, we would do something that was a bit of a stretch, because if you don't take the shot, you're not going to make it. But it couldn't be wildly ridiculous. It couldn't be, we're going to submit a proposal to build a fire truck when what we build are toasters.
Yeah. By the same token, I had a client early on. We were working. He admitted that his team was selling through the proposal. That we're differentiating ourselves, and we're showing value through the proposal. And I had to work with them to get them to understand there's no selling ever done in a proposal. A proposal is an answer, is proof and an answer to the promise that you made. Through the selling, that you heard the problem, you have come up with a solution, you've kind of architected what that solution looks like. The proposal is just the written promise of that solution. There is no selling ever done in a proposal, and so you should be really well down the selling line before you're taking those valuable resources, to your point, John, and putting them to writing a proposal.
Right. You're acknowledging, like you said, that you heard what the customer is asking for or looking for or needs, and you have a solution for it. I want to ask two final questions, and that is, is there anything that you really wanted to cover through the conversation that we've just had that we weren't able to cover, and you'd really like to get it out?
Just to say what I've been saying a different way, maybe, I would just advise your listeners, if you're not modernizing your sales function rapidly, you're probably missing a trick. And that's around technology, that's around digital marketing, and it's around this kind of new buyer dynamic that we're seeing. So I would just say that a lot of the work I do is taking a sales organization that's still operating fundamentally the way it did 10 years ago and kind of bringing it into 2018, 2020.
Yeah, and I, if I may, I'd like to add one additional piece of advice. We kind of talked around it, but when you made statements around how much of the buying process has actually already taken place before a salesperson or sales professional has ever been engaged, and tying that back to proposals as well. If you are just hearing about a request for proposal when it comes out, you're already too late. And if that buyer,
your column fodder.
Yep, that's right. And if that buyer is hearing your name for the first time through your proposal submission, it's a waste of time.
There are a few industries where that's an exception, but I think by and large, you're dead on. There are a few industries where it's so commoditized that the RFP is a real driver. But in most industries, that's not the case.
Steve, where can people find you, your work, or any special causes that you might like to mention?
You can find me at buyeraligned.com, or you can call us at 866-44-ALIGN. I'm also personally active on LinkedIn, which I believe is a tremendous selling resource, by the way. We didn't talk about that. As far as special causes, I'd love to give a shout out to Alzheimer's Association. Personal reasons. My mother has suffered from dementia for over 10 years, and she's one of many, hundreds of thousands of people who do. It's now the 6th leading cause of death. So the Alzheimer's Association is a great organization, really looking to find a cure. So that's kind of my pet.
To our listeners out there, if you want to join our discussion, please find us on find True Chat on social media at TrueChat.org, or you can reach out to me directly on Twitter at John Umstead. You can listen to True Chat podcasts on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and anywhere that fine podcasts are found. For Business is Art on True Chat, I'm your host, John Umstead. And again, my guest today has been Steve McCullough, who is the founder and CEO of Buyer Aligned Selling. Steve, thanks again for being on the show.
It's been a pleasure, John. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it and glad to have you. Thank you all very much for tuning in. We'll see you next time on Business is Art. Be the change.